הדובר הבא שלנו ידבר באנגלית, אבל אני אציג אותו בכל זאת בעברית, כדי להוכיח לנהג המונית שלו שהוא באמת יודע עברית. דניאל בויארין הוא מופקד הקתדרה לתרבות תלמודית באוניברסיטת ברקלי, הוא מלמד במחלקות לרטוריקה וללימודי המזרח הקרוב. דניאל הוא מהבולטים והחשובים שבין חוקרי חז"ל, פרסם ספרים רבים ופורצי דרך בכל תחומי חקר תרבות חז"ל בשלהי העת העתיקה, ממיניות ומגדר ועד מרטירולוגיה והולדת הנצרות. בשנת 2005 נבחר לחבר האקדמיה האמריקאית למדעים ואומנויות. דניאל, בבקשה.
ערב טוב. אני באמת מדבר באנגלית בגלל שנתבקשתי לדבר אנגלית, אז אני רוצה עכשיו כרגע להוכיח שלו יכול ולו לא נתבקשתי, הייתי יכול גם לדבר בעברית. ואם הדיון יתקיים בעברית נוח לי לגמרי, למרות נהג המונית שאמרו לו שהוא צריך לדבר איתי אנגלית כי הם לא מבינים. הוכחתי. Self-knowledge. In her new book, Iyelet Hofmann Libson actually identifies and validates the existence of certain developments within Talmudic halacha as part and parcel of wider shifts in epistemological understanding during late antiquity. Without hypothesizing any particular point of contact between the rabbis of either Palestine or Babylonia and writings in Greek or Latin, she nonetheless argues that that developments of notions of the self that we find evidenced explicitly in such writers as Augustine of Hippo are manifested in halachic concept formation as found particularly in the Babylonian Talmud and especially in the later strata. Note that, as pointed out by Libson, it is no longer so surprising to find so-called Western notes even in the Talmud of the Easterners, the Madim Chai, as once it might have, since scholars such as Shaya Cohen, Richard Kalman, and the writer of these lines have identified such notes over the last 2 decades or so. That is, Western Greco-Roman impacts on the Babylonian Talmud that we don't find in Palestinian sources, right? That seem to have arrived independently to Babylonia. It is thus very much to the point for her to point to said Augustine, who is by consensus regarded as the most articulate representor of a new notion of inner space, in which one can have second-order reflections on one's own thoughts, cognition, emotions, drives. As she writes, quote, "In this study, I argue that Augustinian notions of inner space and the importance of sensory experience and self-knowledge impacted rabbinic culture and can be observed in the transformations undergone by specific sets of rabbinic laws." Unquote. And I want to add a bit of a comment in response to my friend Moshe's point. When we talk about the crucial development of a self, it's not equal to the development of an ani, of an I. It's when the I can comment or reflect on something else that is the self. When you can say, I am disappointed with myself. So the I is separated from the self, right? So that's, I think, that self-reflection. No, I'm not denying the 7. I'm just saying that this is a crucial, different development when the self is different from the ego. I emphasize again that she is very canny and nuanced in her account of Rebecca Liebson, of course, of how such Augustinian notions impacted rabbinic culture, claiming that there is no reason to believe, of course, that the rabbis, that is any rabbi, had read the great African doctor of the church, but that even Augustine himself is simply an eloquent and perspicacious representation of a wider shift in sensibility that was likely to have reached the world of the rabbis as well. So no positive direct connection from Augustine, but read Augustine as a reflection of wider developments that could certainly have, plausibly have impacted the world of rabbinic thought. She therefore proposes that, quote, in attempting to explain dramatic ruptures within the evolution of certain rabbinic laws, it behooves us to be aware of the important cultural changes occurring in the wider milieu in which the rabbis lived, and to utilize the prism of the self in explaining the changes undergone in certain sets of norms, end quote. My only quibble with regard to these excellent insights and formulations of them is with regard to Libson's assertion that the method itself is virtually unknown until now. While this is a particularly excellent example of such work, and it is hardly unprecedented in the last couple of decades to find interdisciplinary work that applies tools of legal theory and cultural studies together. Nor is it fair to characterize Talmudic studies recently as, quote, focused more and more on textual criticism, on the one hand, and theology and narrative, on the other hand, allegedly surrendering the study of the development of the halakha to scholars who operate within the paradigm of mishpat ivri. For generations now, scholarship on the history of halakha in Israel and the United States, at least, has been as anthropological, cultural, as much as legalistic, and certainly not only part of the movement of mishpat ivri. I would mention in this context our departed, lamented colleague, Professor Aaron Shemesh, Zichrono Livracha, and the work of some of his students, Yipodli L'chaim. This is a distinction that makes a difference once we realize, and I hope that I'm not offending the Achsani here, how anachronistic the Mishpat Ivri tradition is from a scholarly point of view. It reminds me of the way modern philosophers love to take Plato, certain modern philosophers love to take Plato and make diagrams of the logic of the arguments and and completely ignore the context of the hiccups and the conversations and the politics and the eros that are going on in the world of those dialogues. So to abstract law and into something called mishpat ivri is, well, I'll come back to that a little. Be that as it may, this book is indeed a first-rate and rich account of the methods of cultural analysis and the study of the history of the halakha. It enters into an important conversation, controversy, with a major new thought and demonstrates the validity of that thought as well. The controversy is whether or not there was a turn in the conception of the individual in rabbinic literature. Joshua Levinson has argued for a significant turn towards interiority and a self from biblical to rabbinic literature, while Ishai Rosentzvi has argued on the basis of Palestinian rabbinic literature that this is a misreading. In this book, the author makes a stunning contribution by showing that both are right and both are wrong. There is such a turn. It takes place, however, according to Liebson, in Amoraic and post-Amoraic Babylonia, and not in rabbinic literature tout court. This conclusion, it cannot be emphasized enough, is of major significance for the interpretation of the history of Jewish ideas. The book is marked by extraordinary sophistication, both with respect to the sensitive historicizing interpretation of rabbinic texts, as well as the infrequent but always judicious reference to both comparative and theoretical texts. The proof of the hypothesis is in the reading. So let's read a bit. Contrasting Tanaitic representations in which the focus is almost entirely on action and not on inner states, she writes, almost startlingly, quote, by contrast, later rabbinic texts expand and intensify the role of various mental categories and grant this intention significant value independent of action. In the Bavli especially, this amplified attention to the mental world corresponds to a preoccupation with the inner workings that distinguish one individual from another. And then comes the real kicker. quote, giving precedence to intention over action and to the individual over the collective ultimately leads to a novel strain of antinomianism in the Bavli. I don't think anyone, till now, has referred to the Bavli as an antinomian work. And I think it's absolutely correct. This is a radical and potentially groundbreaking claim, one that is not incompatible with other recent, methodologically completely other explorations of the Bavli, but goes far beyond them in scope. Other scholars, I'm being a little bit modest there, have located an antinomian strand within the redaction of the Bavli, the work of the Stama, but not within the halachic discourse itself as opposed to the Agadah. This is the signal contribution of Liebson, and she makes it stick. In an elaborate and compelling discussion, Liebson first shows the circumscribed, flat nature of Tannaitic ideas about intention. Intentions are not the sign or a part of a Cartesian thinking subject so much as actions that take place in the mind. They are not nuanced, complex, and individual, but a kind of mental action that together with physical action determine the halachic status of objects and acts in the world. The richest example for her discussion, and one that is compelling, is the discussion in the Mishnah and related literature about the putting of liquids on grains. Right? Yutan, kein, yitain, and other foodstuffs susceptible to the contraction of impurity. The Tanaim first determined that only liquids that are put intentionally cause the fruit to be so susceptible. But then an entirely conventional set of rules for determining such intention are advanced. Thus, if one drinks water, one intends one's lips to get wet, so water dripping from those lips onto fruit will render it susceptible to impurity. Right? Because there's an intention in putting the water on one's lips, it drips from one's lips, so that's intentional. But one does not want to wet one's beard, right? So that's not an intention in drinking. So water dripping from the beard does not. Right? The discussion with respect to the Tannaitic thought world is convincing. But you see, intention here is essentially reduced to or not reduced, but it consists of a set of formal rules for determining what intention is. It is the turn to the later thought, the thought of the Amoraim and post-Amoraic makers of the Talmud, that renders this book so innovative. Liebson demonstrates compellingly that in the later strata of the Bavli, that is in the post-fourth generation Amoraic material, and even more sharply in post-Amoraic strata, the significance of intention is sharply enhanced. Thus, as has been shown, and Liebson here makes excellent use of existing research as well, the category of davar she'en mechaven is dramatically developed in these very later strata to include such categories as psik resha v'lo yamut, and even psik resha de lo nichale, without which none of us would ever open a refrigerator on Shabbos. The role of certain mental states seems thus expanded nearly beyond recognition from Tannaitic times. Similarly impressive and brilliantly analyzed is the question of determination of who ought to eat on Yom Kippur owing to weakness, pregnancy, or illness. The Tannaitic level, in this case the Mishnah, sets standards for precisely how this question is determined and by whom, namely experts of whatever kind. It is ambiguous on this point, what kind of experts, as Liebson shows. This is the nomian approach of the Tanaim. Through subtle and searching analysis of the different layers within the Talmudic discussion, however, Liebson shows precisely how the nomian approach of the Tanaim is displaced in the Bavli by an inquiry addressed to the patient, and her determination of the state of her body takes the place of objective evidence in deciding whether she ought to eat or not. This is certainly a tack that could be named antinomian. It represents, moreover, an important novellum in cultural theory in general as well, for we are used to thinking and asserting that the direction only goes in one way, from the individual, historically, not only among Jews, from the individual to expert authorities. The medicalization of childbirth practices and authorities in the 19th century in Euro-America. What Liebson shows here is how, with developing notions of the self-aware self and thus self-knowledge, such progression was actually reversed within the world of the Bavli. As she writes, quote, the emergence of a more sophisticated inner world and the significance accorded to individual choice influenced the interpretation and construal of the law. While for the Mishnah, experts were best equipped to answer medical questions, by the late Amorite period, only the individual was regarded as capable of recognizing his own needs and making informed choices about his body and life, end quote. QED, or as we would say, Shma Mina. Ach ein bet midrash belo chidush, vein shevach belo tiyot kosverin. The first puzzle, the first tihiyah that I have, has to do with the establishment of chronologies in the history of rabbinic thinking and worldview. How do we determine chronologies? I want to make clear that these interrogations or queries are addressed to the field, not to Liebson's work, but it is her work that has stimulated me in thinking about them now, and I want to say that it is necessary for this kind of research for the researcher or the writer, the scholar, to take a position, some kind of a position vis-a-vis these questions. One of Liebson's subtle and impressive examples involves a shift from the Tosefta to the Sugya and the Bavli. The Tosefta in this case reads, a good thought, the omnipresent joins. A bad thought, the omnipresent does not join. Right? L'maseh. As it says, then how do I fulfill, as it says, and it says what it says, then how do I fulfill, I will bring evil upon this people, the fruit of their thoughts. Rather, a thought that bears fruit, the omnipresent joins with the action. A thought that does not produce fruit, the omnipresent does not join with the action. Liebson is absolutely correct to gloss this as indicating that there is an extra reward for the thought when one does a good deed, but no reward for the thought when no deed is done. Okay? Pay attention. In the Mishnah, the extra reward for the thought, and perhaps even the extra punishment for the bad thought, is only when there's a deed accompanying it. She is, moreover, absolutely correct to indicate that when the Bavli quotes this passage, it adds the following gloss. Rav Asi said, even if one thought to perform a precept and was prevented from doing so, the verse considers him as though he had done it. Right? So here, the machshava, even if you don't actually do the mitzvah, the machshava alone brings the reward. Thus indicating that the thought alone is sufficient to bring a reward to the thinker. And this is significantly different from the earlier Palestinian Tosefta. Here's my question. Who is Rav Asi? Right? As we know, Rav Asi is a very, very early Babylonian Amorah, of the generation of Shmuel, of the very, very first Amoraim in Bavel, and thus seemingly way too early for Liebson's chronology, in which Shmuel himself is treated as one of the very early pre-self-knowledge authorities. Now, Liebson could answer this in several ways. She could say it is not the attribution to Rav Asi that is significant for dating this thought, but the fact that it has been included and is attested only within the redactorial level of the Bavli. Shall we call this the Nusnerian option? A second option would be to suggest that Rav Asi said what he said, but not necessarily in connection with our Braita, and it is the joining of his statement with the Braita, which was presumably done at the late level of production of the Sugya, that determines the dating of this development. We could call this the Friedman Halivni approach, mutatis mutandis. Alternatively, does the fact that it is Rav Asi suggest its earliness, which would then require us to shift our sense of the chronology involved? I am not determining what would be the right or wrong answer to this question, but asking what Liebson's position is on this crucial theoretical point. The point seems local, and even without this example, Liebson has much absolutely convincing proof for her thesis. but it opens us up to much larger questions of method in this type of research. How shall we relate to attributions in the Bavli in terms of determining chronologies of development? My second puzzle has to do again with a much larger problem within the study of rabbinic thinking, namely with the concept of law. A test case. Liebson cites a statement in the Bavli that both Tamar and Zimri fornicated. But since Tamar did it in a good cause, she was rewarded with kings and prophets being her descendants, while Zimri, who fornicated for lust, was rewarded with a terrible massacre in Israel. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, a transgression performed with good intention is better than a commandment performed without good intent. Good. This does indeed bear out Liebson's claim of a certain antinomianism within Babylonian Talmudic thought. A very significant insight. But is nomos law? Is halacha law? Are halachic midrashim legal commentaries, as it is usually translated and which Liebson cites as well? Might halacha not be much closer, rather, to the elaborate systems of taboos or other such practices or doings that are found in many cultures? Nobody thinks of Confucius as a lawyer, and yet he elaborated a very elaborate system of desirable and undesirable behaviors and practices. How would that change our understanding of these historical processes that Liebson has identified, if we're not thinking of them as developments in law, but perhaps as developments in ethics or broader technologies of the self that are not necessarily legal? Liebson quite beautifully writes, I'm quoting, "A doctor can tell a patient to what extent he is endangering himself, but that is not the only factor in the patient's determination of what course of action to take. Even if the patient knows he is in danger, he may nonetheless choose to continue the fast for redemptive reasons. Only the heart, the inner self of the individual, can recognize its own religious needs. Only the individual can correctly assess the bitterness for which she may be atoning on Yom Kippur. And therefore only the individual can engage in proheresis, determining whether to risk pain and even life for the sake of purification and atonement." The transition from the Mishnah to the Babylonian Talmud, from expert to individual, thus reflects the new focus on consciousness or on the individuality of the specific subject. Only the self-knowing subject, reflecting on the agent's internal world, can achieve the correct legal determination, end quote. I ask only, but is it legal? This question niggled at me throughout my reading of the book, but Liebson herself raises it in her final chapter on grounds for divorce. Once again, the demonstration of a shift in sensibility is very attractive, with wife-initiated divorce in the later period being extended even to situations where the wife, is simply emotionally incapable of remaining with the husband. And yes, it does have consequences for another person, the husband. So this is law, but again in such a restricted area. There is certainly an increased attention to emotion, and thus the self in this one area of what we call today family law. But I'm not convinced that this particular development extends beyond this area. And what was the person thinking when he had an ox that gored and didn't properly control it? For instance, I don't think anywhere in Bava Kama we'll find a discussion of that. When Liebson tries to extend this to even one other area of law, namely the question of whether or not her husband may coerce a wife sexually, the alleged shift towards opposing such coercion in the Talmud, which there is, and it's correctly identified and pointed out, does not map onto an expanded sense of the self. And I would add as a sidebar that this is the one instance in the book where I find her reading of the Talmud less persuasive. But I guess I would think that, since it totally dissents from my own interpretation of Herzliya without giving reasons to do so. Liebson herself concedes that this question is at least as much one of ethics as law. Antinomian indeed, but is, I repeat, nomos equal to law? Is halacha law? If we are moving beyond mishpat ivri, we should interrogate this as deeply as we can. I am totally persuaded of Liebson's thesis that there is a rupture between Tanaitic and Babylonian, Amoraic, how late in the Amoraic period, post-Amoraic, senses of self-knowledge and its role in practice. Despite these issues for further discussion, or perhaps because of them, I conclude this is a vitally important book, even groundbreaking work, based on the highest standards of Talmudic scholarship, and I can't emphasize that enough. Nobody can possibly say that this is not a work of Talmudic philology of the highest standards. One that will undoubtedly lead to much more scholarly production, both on the part of its author and also others younger and older who follow in her wake and ask new questions because of it. Mabruk.